Hello, my name is Alice in Flowers-Myland. I'm an Inuk from Labrador and from Nunavik, and I will be reading from pages 109 to 112 of the Truth and Reconciliation Executive Summary. Some dormitory supervisors use their authority to institute dormitory-wide systems of abuse. Many students spoke of the fear and anxiety that spread across the dormitories in the evenings. They went to bed fearful that they might be called into the supervisor's room. To protect themselves, some students attempted to never be alone. Older children sometimes sought to protect younger ones. Most students came to school with little knowledge or understanding of sexual activity, let alone the types of sexual abuse to which they might be subjected. Abuse left them injured, bewildered, and often friendless, or subject to ridicule by other students. Many students thought they were the only children being abused. This confusion made it difficult for them to describe or report their abuse. Some were told they would face eternal damnation for speaking of what had been done to them. Many students fought back against their far larger and more powerful assailants, especially as they got older and stronger. Some succeeded in forcing their tormentors to leave them alone. Many others, such as Lawrence Waquan, concluded that there was, quote, nothing you can do. Some students ran away from school in an attempt to escape abuse. Others begged their parents not to return them to school after a break. Some students never reported abuse for fear they would not be believed. Other students who did report abuse were told that they were to blame. In some cases, school officials took immediate action when abuse was reported to them, but the rarity of such actions is itself noteworthy. Former students spoke of how betrayed they felt when nothing was done about their complaints. Many simply felt too ashamed to ever speak of the abuse. Family members often refused to believe their children's reports of abuse, intensifying their sense of isolation and pain. This was especially so within families that had adopted Christianity and could not believe that the people of God, looking after their children, would ever do such things. The impact of abuse was immediate and long-lasting. It destroyed the students' ability to function in the school and led many to turn to self-destructive behaviors. Staff abuse of children created conditions for the student abuse of other students. Every school system has to deal with school bullies, student cliques, and inter-student conflict. It is part of the socialization process. Ideally, corrective lessons in how to treat others well are taught, as well as shown by example. Residential school staff had a responsibility not only to model such behavior, but also to protect students from being victimized. In many cases, they failed to provide that protection. Conflicts between students are not unique to residential schools, but they take on greater significance in a residential school setting where children cannot turn to an adult family member for comfort, support, and redress. The moral influences that a child's home community can exert are also absent. Instead, the children were left vulnerable and unprotected. Residential schools failed to live up to the responsibility to protect students from being victimized by other students. Older or bigger students used force, or the threat of force, to establish their dominance over younger students. In some cases, this dominance was used to coerce younger or smaller students to participate in sexual acts. In other cases, bullies forced vulnerable students to turn over their treats, their food, or their money, or to steal on their behalf. In addition, bullies might simply seek a measure of sadistic satisfaction from beating those who were weaker. Bullies operated individually or in groups. Such groups were often formed initially as a defensive response to the level of violence within the school, but over time would take on their own offensive characteristics. Sometimes such groups not only focused their anger and or frustration on other students, but also sought to disrupt the general operation of the school. The fact that Catholic and Protestant church leaders continued to disparage one another's religions throughout this period meant that conflicts between the students could also take on religious overtones, particularly in communities with more than one residential school, such as Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. Student victimization of students was an element of the broader abusive and coercive nature of the residential school system. Underfed, poorly housed, and starved for affection, students often formed groups based on age, community of origin, or First Nation. Such groups gave students a measure of identity and status, but also provided protection to their members and dominated more vulnerable students. William Garson recalled that at the Elkhorn, Manitoba school, quote, "We were always like hiding in the corners, away from any abusement, from older elder boys, students." Percy Thompson said that at the Hobima school, quote, "One bully used to come at me and he'd pretend he was going to talk to me and all of a sudden hit me in the belly, and of course I gag, and he'd laugh his head off, and, to see me in such a predicament." Alice Rupert House spoke of, quote, "the cruelty of the other children." At the Amos, Quebec school, quote, "It was, like in a jungle, you don't know what's going to come out, but you had to watch out." Albert Elias felt in the classroom at the Anglican school in Aklavik, quote, "It was the safest place to be in, 'cause that's where nobody could beat me up. I dreaded recesses and lunches and after school. I dreaded those times." Bullying might start shortly after arrival. In some schools, all new male students were put through a hazing. Dennis Morrison said that each new arrival at the Fort Francis school underwent a beating. Quote, "They used to initiate you, like they would beat the hell out of you, the other kids would. It wasn't anybody else, it was the other kids, the older ones, eh?" Bob Baxter recalled that there were student gangs at the Sioux Lookout School. He was beaten up and knifed on one occasion. He had a vivid memory of people tying him to his bed and throwing hot water all over him. Clara Quises said that at the Fort Albany School in Ontario, older girls would threaten the younger ones with knives. Louisa Biro recalled that the girls at the Latuque, Quebec school all formed themselves into hostile groups. Quote, "We hated each other, so this little gang didn't like the other gang. That's the way at the school. That's what we were taught, fears, and we were scared, and I went to hide in what we called the junk room, the junk closet." A lack of adequate supervision in the schools and residences meant that such domination could give rise to physical and sexual abuse. The assaults ranged from being forced to kiss someone, to being forced to simulate a sex act, to being raped. In some cases, victims were given small treats to encourage them to be silent. In other cases, they were told they would be killed if they reported the assault. Agnes Moses recalled being molested by older girls at a hostel in northern Canada. Quote, "I never quite understood it, and it really wrecked my life. It wrecked my life as a mother, a wife, a woman. And sexuality was it was a dirty word for us. The experience of being abused at a British Columbia school by a group of boys left Don Willie distrustful of most people. Quote, "The only friends I kept after that were my relatives." Complaints were infrequent, as students had good reason not to report their abuse. Some feared that bullies would retaliate if they were reported. Others were ashamed of what had been done to them, and some did not fully understand what had been done to them. Many students feared they would not be believed, or would be blamed for somehow bringing the abuse upon themselves. Still others were further punished when they did tell. So rather than report the abuse, many students chose to fight back, to seek admission into a receptive group where violence could be fought with violence, or to endure the pain in silence. This victimization left many students feeling intensely betrayed, fearful, isolated, and bereft of home teachings and protection. The betrayal by fellow students has contributed significantly to the school's long-term legacy of continuing division and distrust within Aboriginal communities. The residential school system's shameful inability to protect students from such victimization, even from among themselves, represents one of its most significant and least understood failures.